Boker Tov.
Ooh, Boker Tov.
Boker Tov and Boker Or.
This week's Torah portion is Parashat Tzav, which means command, like mitzvah. In it, we get some more laws regarding the sacrifices. We still haven't fully I guess we have. This is the inaugural sacrifices, but it's still all pretty much the priests at this point. We haven't really gotten to people bringing offerings yet, but we're getting more layout for it. Some repeats of last week's rules about the various types of offerings: sin offering, guilt offering, thanksgiving offering, etc. And then it later in the portion, there's the formal anointing of the tabernacle and the priests, all the vessels, the opening sacrifice of the bull. Moses gets to do some sacrifices, which is kind of unusual for him. He's not really a priest, although obviously he's of the same clan because his brother is a high priest. And that's pretty much where it ends. There's more. There's lots more blood. Lots of blood in this whole book of Torah. Yeah. So where does any of this land for you guys? Who has a verse or something they want to start with? Debbie, you look like you are poised to say something.
I get this isn't in the meat of the portion, I guess. Didn't mean that as a pun, but it mentions over and over again the portions that Aaron and his sons can have, and we know that this is the priest's way of living, but it doesn't talk about what their families are entitled to. Does that come later? Okay.
That is a good catch. But yes, that is dealt with later, including the women of the Levite clan, because obviously they can't be priests. They don't have jobs in the temple that give them direct access the way the men do. But it somewhere eventually in the Torah we do get that information, and until if she marries outside the clan, then she's no longer eligible to ever come back and eat the holy leftovers again. But up until that point, yeah, we do get that later.
Okay.
There is an interesting in yesterday's daf, there was a weird this is, again, not super related to this parsha as a whole, but to your point about what the priest can eat. There was this question about the priest's tithing and whether when they offer a sacrifice of their own, if they're allowed to eat it, because they're supposed to eat other people's leftovers. But if the priests offer to do their own tithe, and then it goes into the temple offering, then I don't know, there was this weird circular argument about then they could just eat it themselves. I don't know, that it becomes too closed circuit then, which is interesting.
Do you have a reference for that?
Yeah, well, it was in yesterday's Daf Yomi, so it's we're in Shekalim, and it was in Daf 3 Gimel Perek Bet. I mean Amud Bet.
Shekalim 3b.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
yeah.
So does the Torah anywhere talk about priestly offerings? Because they're sort of set apart from the rest of the Israelites, and I didn't think about that. Do they, I mean, they obviously are human and have the same needs and foibles, but does it talk about whether they do that or?
It doesn't really, because so we get like in these early parts of Leviticus, we get the priests doing like the inaugural sacrifices and sort of setting the tone of like, this is how you'll do this one and this is how you'll do that one. So they're sort of doing those types of sacrifices, but it's not really for themselves. It's like a demonstration. And then the rest of the Torah really only ever talks about when when an Israelite brings their sacrifices is how the priest shall perform it for them. So yeah, we really, and to be clear, in Shekalim, it doesn't it's not exactly if they bring their own meal, but it's like, wait, hold on, what does it say? Meal offering. Okay. If the priests contribute their shekels, they will have partial ownership of these offerings that then, like the shekels, like translate into. So it's not that they are offering the meal itself, but it's like this. The bigger context of the daf is why the priests don't have to tithe, which is like a little suspicious, right? Because the priests are the ones collecting the tithe, and it's like, well, so why don't they have, okay, the tax breaks for the rich kind of thing. But then they give this whole like side conversation of like, no, it's actually because, if they were to give the shekel, then it was as if they owned the meal or like part of the offering, and then could they eat it? It's like, so it becomes, it's a little circular like that. So it's not direct, but yeah, we don't really have anything that I can think of in the Torah that talks about their own offerings, except that actually, wait, there is I can't remember now which parsha it is, but there is, I think maybe it's not in Leviticus, it's later, where there's sort of a hint about like if a priest sins or if a judge sins, that there's a little bit that there's a higher they need to do more public teshuva besides the offering itself, because they should be held to a higher standard as leaders, or that they need to be seen more publicly modeling how to do teshuva. I can't remember which parsha it is. I want to say it's somewhere in Deuteronomy though. I don't think it's in Leviticus. I can't remember. Joel's good with citations. Do you know what I'm talking about, Joel?
Yes, but I don't know exactly where it is.
Okay.
True.
So yeah, go ahead. You have something
Sure.
else?
Can I just throw out a quick summary and how it affects what's going on in America and in the world today? So it's this. From Bereshit, it's the beginning of the universe. And we move forward and I can see piece by piece what's going on. So Leviticus is what we call carbonot, K-O-R-B-A-N-O-T, carbonot. From the word korban means to bring us closer to God. That's the word karov. So carbonot. Now there's another important word that we could get confused with. Okay, it's called zevachim. It means sacrifice. So you might say, wait a minute, sacrifice, sacrifice, isn't carbonate sacrifice? What's the difference? So I happened to look it up, and Rabbi Goldstein, I did a word search on Sefaria, very simple to do, takes 10 minutes exactly. And there is no use of the word carbonate before Leviticus chapter 2. In other words, all of Genesis, I couldn't find it. All of Exodus, I couldn't find it. Yet we have plenty of sacrifice. I picked up at least 10 or 12 very, very clear incidents of sacrifice. That would be the Zevach, Zevachim plural. By the way, there's a whole tractate in Talmud. You can read 600 pages in the English if you're so inclined, or you can read it in the Hebrew or the Aramaic if you're so inclined. So there's a lot to study. All right, so sacrifice, sacrifice. This sacrifice brings us closer to God, karov, to draw us closer. So to me, I started to think about the events of the past year. And we have all these people rioting here and there, and some of them are anarchists. I do not like anarchists, I'm sorry. Some of them are socialists. I do not like socialists, especially from 1917. They caused a lot of death in the world, okay? And I'm thinking today, what's the message today for me? The message is this. When I get to Leviticus, I am told that you by yourself are no longer going to be able to sacrifice to God. Like, don't think you're Abraham, you're going to give a little sacrifice before you're going to dispatch Yitzchak. No, 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 that's done with. What we're going to do from this point forward in time till the end of time is we're going to draw ourselves closer to God. Carbonate. Carbonate says there are appointed people to handle this. The anarchists don't believe this. The anarchists are trying to tell me, oh no, we're gonna destroy everything. We don't like any of this structure. The socialists, the same. Oh no, you folks, we're not going to have a king. We're not going to have a czar. Okay, yeah, he's not perfect, but we're going to take over, and let's just see what we're going to do. Oh my God, that led to World War I and World War II. So the Bible tells us, if you have any sense, please read Leviticus and see the overall message. And by the way, it's the details are there, piece after piece after piece. I won't bore you with the details because some of the words are, it's a study in itself. But that's my overview. Leviticus.
So if the difference between the two words for sacrifice are that start after Leviticus, the sacrifices bring you closer to God, what was the purpose of the sacrifices before Leviticus that used the other word, which I'm not good enough to yes. So if that, what was the purpose of those sacrifices?
All cultures known to mankind get the bright idea, if there's been no rain for a while, they're going to round up 20 virgins. They're going to go up to where the volcano is and toss them in. Now, what they think that's going to accomplish, I have no idea. So,
but we're talking specifically about the Israelites or Jews or Hebrews or whatever in Genesis and Exodus before Leviticus. What was the purpose of their sacrifices?
Well, I think that's open to a lot of interpretation. I think we need Rabbi Goldstein to help out. My personal thought is that much of this was not codified, was not written, was not canonized until the year around 486, around 100 years after the destruction of the temple. And that's where a lot of biblical scholarship leads us today.
The first temple. Yeah.
So in other words, the time of Josiah. So what they're doing is here's the word we always use, they're retrojecting. Retroject means I make a story about colonial America. I bet I could do a pretty good story, except I better not write iPhone. I better not write anything that I know from today. So what they did was they retrojected, and I'm sure they leaned upon the folklore, because I'm sure people told each other oral stories for at least the last 10,000 years. I know they did. I know they did. So some of these people said, we better write some of this down because the meanings are just going to change. So let's write it down so Joel will have something to do. I can research, I can study. I won't get bored. That's it.
To answer your question though, Debbie, the expressed reason in the Torah itself is gratitude. Anytime Abraham, Jacob, oh no, I guess that doesn't work for the Israelites in Egypt before the last plague. But at least Abraham and Jacob, there are very key moments where they give sacrifices in gratitude. You know, Abraham has made it through his journey from Babylonia to the Holy Land. Jacob has escaped his brother sufficiently and had his miraculous dream. He sets up the altar at Bethel. So usually it's gratitude, and then the Pesach sacrifice is its own very specific purpose. So as opposed to the idea of just, essentially it is still the same, right? It is about feeling a connection to God in some way or the other, but it's less about, it's not an act of worship in like a formal sense, the way it becomes once the Mishkan is set up.
Yeah, I can see that it's now how to, and so you're following God's rule instead of doing what you feel, or including it. I hope that you would include your feelings in this, but you're following a regimen, whereas before it just what seemed good. But it seems like they both would bring you closer, like we talked about sacrifice last week in general, about sacrificing today, and not cows, but whatever we sacrifice, it could bring us closer to our idea of God, whatever that is.
I think it's analogous to the difference between blessing and prayer, or like liturgy and prayer, which I mean also makes sense because prayer is the descendant of sacrifice.
Right.
But like you can offer up a spontaneous prayer and it just like is what it is, or you can dive in the written blessings of our ancestors 3 times a day, you know what I mean? So that, there's a difference in that as well.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
Yeah. So let's see, where shall we go next? Well, we've got, oh no, it's not. The fire on the altar shall be kept burning. It's one of my favorite lines. It shall not go out. Oh, the next one is Eish tamid tukad al hamizbeach lo tikbeh. I love that line. It's a good song too. Eish tamid tukad al hamizbeach lo tikbeh, lo tikbeh, and you just repeat it like a chant. You can like weave in different harmonies, and it's beautiful.
Which line is that?
6:6.
Okay. So, and I guess this goes back to Joel's explanation about the timelessness of what we read in Torah verses, that it all flows and intertwines. But I had trouble imagining this perpetual fire while the Israelites were marching for 40 years through the desert, it certainly, when they set up the temple, it would be easy to follow, but it must have been difficult.
Yes, which is part of the, I mean, the Mishkan is so amazing to think about. This like whole movable sanctuary with layers, right? It's not just a tent. It's, there's the outer wall and the inner tent and the altar and the vessels and all of this, and that they could just like pick it up and move it, and the fire doesn't go out. It's pretty remarkable. And also the fire doesn't spill and light the whole tent on fire.
But it's sort of like our Constitution, things written 200 years ago still work today. So the things written for the desert worked after people settled. And I'm sure it's not just this, but all the rules and regulations were for just keep working if you pay attention to them and think about them.
Right, and that they have to be a living document to do that.
Mm-hmm.
That you have to be able to reinterpret and not continue to try to take everything at face value, but understand that it was a blueprint for
exactly,
for a timeless rule of law.
I find some of the mentionings in this Parshat good rules to keep a healthy kitchen. I'm looking at chapter 7, verse 9. The flesh that touches any contaminated thing may not be eaten. It shall fire. And there's other parts, and not just this Parshat, but before this too, where it's basically telling people how to properly slaughter an animal. I've done that myself, but I know that removing the organs is important because they can contaminate the food.
They can go septic faster. Yeah.
I found that interesting. Because I cook sometimes, I thought that was good advice.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get much more into kashrut and things like that in a later parsha, also in Leviticus, though. I think it's next week, actually. I don't know. Not next week because of Passover, but 2 weeks. Next parsha, where we get more into kashrut, but I think a lot of it does have to do with, like, at its core, health and safety and concern for the well-being of animals, and a lot of it was sort of proto health code, FDA, and I lost my train of thought. What was I gonna say? Oh yes, okay, I was gonna say, so it's interesting, we do continue to evolve in our animal agriculture as well, but there are so many things that are completely immoral about animal agriculture as we, in the industrial age, that I think kashrut could help recenter, but then it's used as an excuse for anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in like several European countries. I think France just recently passed a law or is trying to pass a law. I know Scandinavian countries have tried to do it in the past. Belgium, I think, did it successfully, but trying to ban kosher and halal meat because, the slitting of the throat is considered barbaric as opposed to the stun gun to the head or whatever. And it's just like either way, the animal does die pretty quickly. Like the slitting of the throat was considered a more humane way before the Industrial Revolution. And as far as industrial meat agriculture goes, like, is the stunning to the head really going to make up for the years of abuse that the cattle go through before they're killed? Like, where does this line of morality come from when meat agriculture is already so disgusting? And maybe it's less disgusting in Europe than it is in America. I can't say I know exactly, but I doubt it.
This is a little off topic, but there was an article back when they were talking about the COVID abuse of meat workers.
Yeah.
There was an article in the Post specifically that cited a large kosher meat plant, and you can argue why the Post chose to put this article in the paper, but still, these are supposed to be, pious Jews running this thing, and yet they totally mistreated, forced their workers to work in very bad COVID conditions, and COVID was rampant. And
Yes.
so makes you wonder. Now, that's probably true of most of the large meat packing plants, no matter what their cultural background was, but it was still interesting.
Yes, I agree. And that's why there has been a movement for the last 30, 40 years now. I think it went back to maybe the late 70s, of eco-kashrut or ethical kashrut, that it's not enough to just follow the law of like the specifics, because, again, like these laws are written pre-industrial. So if you're going to try to keep up with the demand and use the tools more or less of an industrial age, you have to update your kashrut and your ethics as well. And there was it Chicago where that big, the Chicago area where that big,
in the Midwest,
yeah, the big scandal was, where the kosher slaughterhouse was found to be, first of all, dirty, which, like, again, sort of defeats the purpose of the original point of kashrut in a time before clear health and safety laws. It was obviously meant to give guidance to stay safe in eating animals. So the fact that the slaughterhouse itself was filthy is of deep concern for various reasons. And then also that it was completely abusing its workers. And that was pre-COVID, but still, I mean, I remember when that scandal was in the news, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago now.
Yeah.
And it just was like, there is that, like, oh, it's a shanda feeling of like anytime Jews are in the news for doing something bad. But there's also the, like, we have such clear guidance on these things. Like, how can you claim to be an Orthodox Jew, to be so pious, and then do these things that are clearly against our values? And they excuse it because, treat your fellow as yourself really only applies to fellow Jews. So if you don't employ Jews, you can abuse your workers as much as you want. So, yeah, Joel.
So last week, David Gilbert asked the question. He noticed some very, very tiny letters in his copy of the Chumash. And there's another one coming up right here today. So here we are at Leviticus 6, verse 2. And while I'm reading that, I notice one of the Hebrew words, and when I look at the Hebrew, one of the Hebrew words is around 3/4 the size of the other Hebrew words. It's visibly smaller. The word is mokta, and I think it's at one of the ends of the lines. So I don't know if you have any Hebrew in the copy that you're using. If you do, just take a look at 6:2 and see if you can pluck out. There's a small letter that's about 3/4 the size of the other letters. Anybody see it?
the Safari doesn't have different
Or you doesn't
sizes.
have it, I checked. David Gilbert's does, because I already checked the Sansino. And even more interesting, so that's called a miniature M. Miniature means it's smaller. And Ze'er is a common Hebrew word, if there's any Hebrew speakers. And it means miniature, means exactly that. And I said, I better check myself and make sure before I speak out. I always call it Mem Ze'era. And if David Gilbert looks in his copy,
Yep.
you see it? In
Yep.
very, very tiny letters. And what I did a screen grab of it just for myself. I put it in my notebook just to remind myself so I don't have to go back and study the whole thing all over again. So this is what's interesting to all of us. It's gotta be interesting. Like, here is this whole story. And as I'm reading this, I can't help but notice there's a little signal there. So someone here is going to say, wait a minute, maybe they just ran out of the regular size M's and someone had to stick in the tiny one. So I said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I went back to the Sefer Torah. Sefer Torah means the Torah scroll. That's the thing we take out on Shabbat and we unroll it. It's all handwritten. God forbid if you make one tiny mistake, not only do you get fired, but they can't even use that Torah unless they can correct it a little bit. In other words, it's serious business. And so this information has been there perhaps 2,000 years. So I have to ask myself, what are they talking about here? And Rabbi Goldstein, I did go to the commentators. One of the books we have is called Mikraot Gedolot. That's like a giant Torah where there's so much commentary. There's Rashi, there's all these guys. By the way, Rashi was born in the year 1040. It's 979 years ago. So trust me, there've been a lot of very, very smart people who've been looking this over. Not a word from Rashi, not a word from any of them. I've been working on it. I have some ideas, but I think it's too detailed. We don't want to get so far into the weeds, into the woods, we lose track of what we're doing. But this is some of the stuff that makes Torah so dear, so important, and so necessary, not just for me, for the world, for all of us. Isn't that true?
Mhm.
Lamar, I love what you said last week. You must have some good observation. And Brandy, I love what you have to say. So where are we today?
Well, I'm trying to follow you on 6:2, but I don't see any little mem.
Okay, you're on the
Wait.
Hebrew side?
Yeah, I'm on the Hebrew side.
And okay,
Now, how can you tell? How do you know where 6:2 is in the Hebrew? Because in the English it has little numbers, but in the Hebrew I see the alphabet on the right. I think that's what it says alphabet, dalet.
So the bet would be 2.
in other words, this is before there was such a
It'll
thing.
say it on the outside of the margin will have bet, and then you have to zoom in and look for the colon, because that if it doesn't start at the front of the line, the colon is the period.
Do you see a bet?
Probably. I mean, I don't know what version you're using, but that's usually the case. So find the
Right.
bet on the margin and then look in the line for where the colon is. And then the next word to the left of the colon is actually the start of verse 2.
All right, I found the colon.
So then let's see, this word mukta is halfway through the verse.
Not the 13th word. If you're counting when there's a hyphen, you count each side of that as a full word. In mine, it's at the next to last word of the second line.
Yeah. Sav et Aharon ve'et banav lemor zot Torat ha'olah Hi ha'ola al mokta. Do you see that word yet?
I see the little tiny mem.
Okay.
That's it. All right.
And what does that word translate into?
That it's the burning on the altar. It's the same root. Mokta is the same root as tukad al hamizbeach. It's the mokta al hamizbeach. Here it says that it will remain burning there, or remain on it. I don't know. Remain, I guess, is the word they're using in the English for that, but it's not. I don't know. If that's a good direct translation, but.
And the small m is to attract our attention to the word, or we don't know? Okay.
Yes.
I think it might be, so when usually when a mem, no, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't work. Never mind. I take that back. I'm not sure why the mem is there. I mean, yeah, sure, to attract our attention to it, but I'm sure.
Sounded like Joel knew about this, and then he decided not to share because he thought it was too much detail.
Well, I mean, do you have other, well, he said he had theories, but you don't, right? Joel, what do you say? What do you think?
Well, what I did, my latest bag of tricks includes, we have other documents. The one I'm talking about is called Targum Onkelos.
Mm-hmm.
It's written in Aramaic, unfortunately. Okay.
What, you don't speak Aramaic?
Yeah, it's written completely in Aramaic. It was written 1900 years ago. And there's a very interesting reason why they even wrote it. So few people understood Hebrew. They would listen to these stories and they desperately wanted to know what was being said. So they created this book, this 1900 years ago, in Aramaic. It's called Targum, means an interpretation or a translation. And Onkelos was the author, or the purported author. And someone, while they would be reading this in the Hebrew, this guy would kind of chant along in Aramaic. Why Aramaic? Because the people of the time spoke Aramaic. This was the time slightly before Jesus. He spoke Aramaic, obviously. People in Babylonia spoke Aramaic. So they're just like us. No, they weren't the big scholars. They were just like us. So I looked at the Aramaic, and that slows me down seriously because I have to look up like 2 words out of 3. Only thing is, I don't even know where to look it up. There's no dictionary. So anyway, I pulled
You can get Aramaic dictionaries.
Well,
Jastro.
There's the HUC has a dictionary of sorts, but it's not a nice clean dictionary. I want to type the word in. I want them to tell me what it means.
Oh, yeah,
What?
maybe not online. There is an Aramaic dictionary book that is a nice clean one. It's by Marcus Jastro.
Oh, Jastrow, sure. So of course he was the rabbi at our shul up here in Philadelphia.
That I did not know.
Yeah, he's an outstanding scholar. This is like 120 years ago, by the way.
Yeah.
But it's kind of good because I've done a lot of study in the basement that I'm sure Jastrow himself studied in. It's like in the basement of the synagogue. They knocked down the old synagogue. They put up a new synagogue. That's already 90 years old. But the basement, the foundation, I'm right there where he studied.
So Jastro is primarily Aramaic for Talmud So they call it a Jastro jackpot when you're looking up a word, and then the citation besides the translation or the definition gives you the exact sugya, the exact Talmud citation you're looking at. Then it's like, jackpot. So that wouldn't work so well with Onkelos, but it would still, I mean, the
Yeah.
translation part would still be there. They would still have I think he would still have all these words. So the word in Aramaic is demitokta.
Yep.
So what does this tell you? I mean, so there was a lot going on in your explanation that didn't really get us to the root of how does Onkelos tell you why the M or the mem is small?
Okay, they don't tell you why. All they do is they translate it into.
No, but you started to give us this explanation as a reason for your understanding of the small mem. So I want to know how they're connected.
So my own personal interpretation, which I have no support for, I can't find it in Talmud, I can't find it anywhere, is the letters Kuf Dalid are the same letters from the word pakod. Yifkod Pekudehem, and that means kind of when you muster up an army, you're kind of counting people, and we see a lot of the word pakad in Torah. And I believe that the creator of the universe has actually created every single soul that's here. He's really saying every single soul is important. And he relates it to this firewood issue, firewood, and the firewood is olah, they're bringing you up. Olah is the word aliyah. If you're called up to the Torah, you go up to, it's called an aliyah. You're going to call me up for an honor. If I move to Israel, I'm going to make aliyah. Also, topologically, if you go to Israel from the surrounding area, you're really going up. Israel's sort of the high ground compared with the surrounding territory. So you're going up. So whenever I see ha'olah, olah also means that's the first of these
Sacrifices.
sacrifices, the carbonate sacrifices, because we're going to get closer to God by going up. Now, if you look at Cézanne's artwork, for example, if you look at the large bathers, it's in the Philadelphia Art Museum, and you see, oh my God, look, everything, all the trees and everything, what he's calling attention to is that everything in the universe is going up. Now, Cézanne was not Jewish. Cézanne did not study Torah. This is my little interpretation. And by the way, Cézanne was an impressionist. Impressionist means it's his own interpretation. It's his own targum. It's his own, that's why it's his impression. That's why they call him an impressionist. Like some little wise guy is going to come over and say, wait a minute, that doesn't look like trees. Look at those bathers you made. You can't even see their faces. Like, come on, don't you know how to paint? And he's going to say, no, no, no. This is my impression. Okay, this Torah portion is my impression of what's going on. It's my own.
Well, your drash is your own impression. The
Yeah.
Torah portion is.
But what I will do, and I do this all the time, I study a little further and I say, oh my God, completely wrong. So I have to defer to the wiser minds that have gone before.
I don't know, Joel, it sounds to me like you made a pretty good argument that this whole Parsha is really about getting closer to God, and that the incredible detail and what shall be done in what order and for each of the sacrifices, it's all related to getting closer to God.
Well, I would say that's
that's the
what the
purpose.
whole book of Leviticus is about, really.
Yeah. And in fact, verse 20 of 6, whoever shall touch the flesh thereof shall be holy. That's what our spiritual goal is. That's what our journey is,
Right.
to approach holiness. So I think there you've certainly given me some stuff to think about, Joel.
Well, thanks. So why do Yehudim, people of the Jewish tradition, not eat chazir? Chazir means pig or pork or swine. Why is that?
It's unclean.
Well, that's again,
Before
that's in
we-
the next parsha. So let's hold off on that and
Sure.
address Lamar's question in the chat. So certain animals were designated to be sacrificed. The sacrifices seem to have taken place in many places around the world. Okay, so first of all, that's mostly not true for Jews. There are, as Joel pointed out, there's a few sacrifices that happen early on in the Torah in various places, and in the Mishkan, they're wandering the desert, but it only happens in the Mishkan. And then once the temple is built, sacrifices only happen in the temple. So once the temple is destroyed, there's no more sacrifices for Jews.
Not that kind of sacrifice anyway.
Right, not animal sacrifice. So that's one thing. The evolving purpose of sacrifice, I think Joel sort of hinted at this before, is that there was a very pervasive culture of sacrifices in the ancient world of various sorts of animals or people. And so the Jewish form is an evolution to say only animals, only kosher animals, and for these specific reasons that mostly have to do with like sin and expiation, atonement, that like you have to give up something to show you're truly sorry. There are like the offerings of thanksgiving and the offerings of well-being and the olah, the burnt offering and things like that, but mostly Jews do not do the we need to make an offering to get rain thing, at least not so directly. There is in Deuteronomy an implicit connection that all of the commandments, following the commandments, including but not limited to those about sacrifice, merit a good agricultural year and like that kind of direct benefit from God. But it's not as like precise as it is in a lot of pagan cultures, for example, where like you have to spill the blood of the innocent over your field to make sure that that field is blessed. Like there's nothing like that in the ancient Jewish world. And so this question of will sacrifices return is kind of complicated for Jews. The short answer is no, it will not. Again, because we don't do sacrifices outside of the temple. So there has not been a Jewish sacrifice, an animal sacrifice for 2,000 years since the second temple was destroyed. In those intervening 2,000 years, other things, other holy meanings have been heaped onto the Temple Mount, such that if we tried to rebuild the temple, it would for sure start World War III. Like it would be a horrible, we just wouldn't get it done. Like I can't imagine any realistic way that it could be finished building, that there would even like be an Israel left. Like it would be a hole in the ground. So there's that. There's also, there are some people, like a very fringe minority, who still think it's worth trying and that God will be on our side. But for the most part, Jewish theology seems to indicate that the third temple is ephemeral, is a heavenly temple. That, like, when Ezekiel talks about a third temple being built, which, by the way, Ezekiel is writing in the first exile before there's even a second temple, but he's already predicting a third temple that will be in the messianic age, that will be like heavenly, that all time will have stopped. And so in that version also, like, we don't rebuild the temple, so there's no way to predict when and how we'll have temple again. And I think that there's still not really animal sacrifice, because there's no bloodshed, there's no death in that time in the messianic age. There's, the lion will lie down with the lamb kind of stuff. So, like, yeah, so we're not spilling any blood. The temple will serve a different purpose when that time comes. So that's, from a Jewish perspective, there will never be sacrifices again. There is no purpose to sacrifice restoration. We've moved completely beyond it in both like a logistical, historical sense, and also in the evolution of our theology. So today, so that's why now we have to like re-understand what sacrifice means, as we talked about last week, and as Debbie kind of reminded me at the beginning of that rant that I just said, of that like we still get closer to God by sacrifice, but now it's sacrifice of giving our time and money and energy and giving from the heart, using our intellect to make the world better, to get closer to God through prayer, tikkun olam, things like that. So it's a totally different evolution of how we understand what sacrifices mean.
So we talked last week a little bit, Lamar, about today's sacrifice, and a good example would be your willingness to give up a day of work and giving up your time to deliver necessities to the Nuri family. And that's not, and we talked about this last week, that's certainly tikkun olam, fixing the world, but also you doing that would bring you closer to whatever your idea of God is. So you covered that. You and Chava both, if I could brag for you, offered to help out with the Nuri family this weekend. So thank you guys.
I also just want to correct Joel that if any diasporic life is considered exile, then our exile is not just Eastern Europe and America. That's not where Jews live exclusively. So either we embrace diasporic life and say that, for the last 400 years, 375 years, America has been a home for American Jews, or we say that everything outside of Israel is exile, including that of African Jews and South American Jews and Asian Jews. We don't erase those Jews. So last comments on the Parsha before we close. Well, okay then. We don't always talk about or try to drash directly on the names of the parshas, which are just, the parshas are named for the first substantive word of it, right? So like in this case, in a lot of Leviticus, like the second half of Exodus, most of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, the parsha begins, or like every other line begins with Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, or Vayomer Adonai El Moshe Lemor, or Vayomer Moshe. Like it's a lot about just God and Moses talking to each other is the opening of every parsha. So then the first substantive word is Tzav, and that's the name of the parsha. So sometimes it's just like, this is the first word and it's not relevant. But I think it's interesting to think about too, like what does it communicate to us in this case, or in any case, but command, that it's the same root as mitzvah, but it's one of the few times we see it in the I'm not good with parts of speech. I do know this word. When it's a command.
Imperative?
Imperative, thank you. Yes, that it's a direct, like, you shall. It's like the difference between Baruch and Barchu, right? You will do this thing. And so I just, and here it's to Aaron. Aaron will do this thing. It's a very specific mitzvah that it is just worth, thinking about. So I lost my train of thought. I saw Joel's thing in the chat again and got distracted. But yeah, so I guess here is my final drash. This is like, what is it that you directly feel commanded to do? What is your personal work to bring about a more selfless giving community? So I'll leave you to ponder that. Remember, there is no Torah study next week. Feel free to read up in the beginning of Exodus or the Numbers. I forget what the exact citation is. Maybe Debbie I'll send it to Debbie later and she'll put it in the next e-kibbutz that you can read on your own. But it's the festival Torah reading is part of Numbers, where it tells you what the sacrificial, what it is you're supposed to offer for Pesach in the time of the temple. So we'll skip that and come back to our weekly Parsha with Shmini in 2 weeks.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Is this
See you.
Thank you.
Happy Pesach.
Happy Pesach.